Welcome to the Learner Experience Evolution, a podcast for corporate learning leaders, featuring interviews with change enthusiasts at Alencom and in the larger corporate L&D community.
Welcome, everybody, to our session on innovation. This is one of the many podcasts we do to help our industry and our peers get tips and tricks and hear stories about how learning leaders are innovating in their practice. I'm joined by Gina. She'll introduce more of herself from the UnitedHealth Group. And this is me, Zamir, CEO of Alencom. And we are going to spend the next 10, 20, 30 minutes really exploring how we innovate within our world and our practice. So with that, Gina, I'm going to get us started, and I am going to ask one of my favorite questions, and that is, what got you into this industry, and what has been your journey from wherever you started to where you are now?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here today. So I am Gina Montefusco. I have the privilege of working in our enterprise learning group at UnitedHealth. And my journey has been a little I always say windy in that. I started my career as a pediatric ER nurse and an ER nurse. I did that for 10 years. I got into leadership, and I always say I wasn't doing well. And when I was getting my master's, I got recruited into an OD team because they were looking for a clinician who could really speak to other clinicians. And I kind of said, well, I don't know this whole leadership thing. And they said, we can teach you that. And that was kind of a turning point in my career. I had always thought I was going to be doing hospital administration, and that was a turning point for me. I fell in love with this opportunity to continue to help individuals grow. And for me, it's not make the same mistakes that I made. So I had the opportunity to work in that OD team and really learned a lot when it came to leadership development. We did everything. We did leadership development, we did team development, we did individual development. And through that, I ended up having an executive coach that then I said, oh my gosh, I want to do that. So then I did executive coaching, did that for a small time, and then ended up in UnitedHealth Group. And I've been there for the last 5 years, and it's been such this opportunity to scale things into ways I never thought I would, and really think about pushing that envelope on how you build scalable and impactful content across. And I will say, shout out to Alencom because they've been a major partner to me through that. And that's how I got here.
Well, your journey is actually very logical. Those of you that have heard this before, I started as an archaeologist in the beautiful old city of Jerusalem. And luckily, the military straightened me out and got me into instructional design. So there's a lot of curves in the journey to do part of what we're all passionate about, is impact people, processes, and behaviors. UnitedHealth Group is, I think, over 400,000 employees. So let's dig into that, because you kind of represent, the place. Okay, how do I scale? How do I innovate? And share with me some of the tensions, if at all, that exist between scale and innovation, and how you manage those processes in your job.
Yeah, when I think about scale and innovation, and then part of being part of a healthcare company. So healthcare companies overall, or healthcare in general, they're used to very standard ways of instruction, very standard ways for development, skill, awarding, skill, they also are good with technological platforms that don't work. So part of this for me is this tension of how do you innovate and go to where, we see L&D going, see these innovative spaces, but be able to bring our employees along, especially leadership who may not be bought into some of the more innovative things that we're trying to do, or understand why we would be looking to drive into that way.
Yeah, a big theme of our discussions, and I would love your reaction to, is how do we move from being reactive to proactive, right? To innovate, you can receive and say, hey, I want AI in everything now, go do it. Or you can say, or they can say the opposite, I don't want any AI, and you say, well, here's what I can do in it. So talk a bit about your experiences on being able to navigate that reactive expectation and turn that into a proactive role for yourself and your team.
Yeah, I think for me in that, a lot of our, especially big corporate places, can be very reactive, right? Some executive comes in, they now want this or that, and now it's to say jump. When I think about that, I think that it's our role to spend the time to understand what that means, the impact to our teams, what we can really gain from that, and really engage in dialogue with our leaders to help them make a better, not always a better decision, but to not be as reactive. The other thing for me is like, how do we show data on what is working so that we don't throw out what we know works just because this new thing is coming down the pike? And that's a lot of times how I try to balance, and I challenge my team in that. That also means that we have to keep up with what's coming.
Yeah.
So that I'm not blindsided by that request.
It's always a dilemma for me how, as a vendor, we tend to be brought in to push our clients a bit out of their comfort zone. And there's that thin border when it's too much, right? When you work with your partner to do something they've never done before, but it's too much for their leadership or for their SMEs, or even through their internal team, versus pushing to the edge and a bit beyond so they can be more innovative. How often do you encounter that in your work? And it doesn't have to be with Alencom, with anybody, in getting out of your comfort zone or not getting out too much?
I mean, I think for me, I try to put myself in that space. How can I do that or be open-minded to that? I grew up, my career as a nurse, we're really great at finding all the reasons why we shouldn't do something. So for me, I personally challenge myself to I need to identify those to feel good. And how do I push through that? And that's at that reactive, proactive thing that you already mentioned, right? So the way I like to think about that is here's your great idea. Let's figure out what could go wrong with that before we do it. And then let's kind of lean into it where it makes sense and push the boundaries. I think for me, it's often this challenge too, the scale at which we operate.
Yeah.
To me, it creates this huge space to really push the envelope. I think for some people, it can also, though, make them very reactive because we are a slow ship to steer. And so my push often is let's give it a trial. Let's give it 3 months. Let's give it 6 months. You can't just after 1 month say something doesn't work.
Yeah. And it's natural, right? All these customers of ours that are over, let's say even over 50,000, we won't even go to 400,000. Scale does necessitate some level of compromise.
Mm-hmm.
In being very, you can't punch through like you would if you had a small team, if you were a lot of our customers are leadership leader. They have to work with, 100 top leaders. It's different than having now to scale something across, hundreds of thousands of people. But you can still innovate, right? You can still scale. And I think that mindset that you're describing is something that's so valuable in our industry, because we do get beat down a bit. I apologize for using a kind of a harsh term. Governance models beat us down. New executives, they don't want to beat us down, but they kind of give us new information when we weren't expecting it. Talk a bit more about the mindset. And when you have to advise a new team member, how do you define the mindset that you want on your team so you can scale and innovate?
Yeah, I think the mindset for me is partially let's keep trying. And I think we have to acknowledge sometimes what we do have to give up for scale. I mean, there are things that we have to give up. I truly believe and love doing, leadership development or programmatic content in which I can go with a small group of individuals and really shepherd them through something. That's why I'm a coach. And how do I push the mindset to say, yeah, but we have this opportunity to impact 400,000 people who then impact the numbers are staggering when you think about then those people who we interact with and who our company has influence on when we think about the American healthcare system, which is fraught with a lot of, good things and bad things. But it's how do I get them to keep pushing even when we get that kind of resistance sometimes. I tell my team all the time, we need to be out harvesting the resistance. Harvest that resistance. Tell me what's wrong or what that team thinks is wrong. The other thing for me is I operate sometimes like it is a small company because truthfully, if I can move one VP, they may have 5,000 employees. I mean, they're the size of some companies. And so with that, it's how do we still build relationship? How do we still just continue and get out and market what we do and know that it's the right thing?
I really like something you said in my words, maybe not yours, is you're embracing the challenges versus trying to weave away or between the challenges, right? So some people, as this is an old, sorry for my grandmother saying, she would say, well, you got to know how to dance between the raindrops sometimes in life, but you're actually letting those raindrops hit you right and then creating your own path through those raindrops. We talked a lot about the teams. We talked a lot about, the 400,000. Sometimes, though, it comes down to the leadership you have to engage with in order to bring them on board. Share
Hmm.
some of the journeys you take with leadership and how that helps you reach that, pushing that envelope that you described and how you scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me and the way I operate, I work very hard to involve leaders as much as they want to, right? You have some VPs that just want to know, they think that, Gina does a great job, great, kind of keep going. There are others who want more detail. And so for me, it's taking the time to learn the
Yeah.
executive, to know what they need. The other piece for me, and it speaks, I think, loudly to the executives that I work with,
Hmm.
is the need to have employee and learner data to
Yeah.
test along the way and ensure that what we're doing is being received. Because when I have that information, so one of the ones that course we were just talking about, which is this gamified course that got assigned to 200,000 people, we did multiple. I mean, 10,000 people probably took that course or had some part in that course before it ever launched. That also makes it feel like not a surprise. And I use huge stakeholder groups. So for one course, I might have 40 to 45 people who
Yeah.
are reviewers of the content. And for me, that is incredibly important. I can't be in the businesses and
Yeah.
I can't know what's going to resonate with them, but the stakeholders can. And so those two together help me to tell a story that says, this is how I know that it's going to land and why I know it's going to land.
No, I love that. And you piqued my curiosity because we all know how learning teams are usually squeezed. They're not very people heavy, right? To say the least. And I don't want our listeners to think that if they're a team of three, they can't do any of this. But because the reality is, most learning organizations are between 2 to 12. Right. You bring up an issue because our experience is a lot of the learning groups. If you take away their day-to-day trainers that do the day-to-day work, which gives them a lot of size, right? They're project managing. They're getting
Mm-hmm.
a task and they're figuring out how to do it. They do it with a vendor, without a vendor. But you brought up something else: is putting in your project management mindset a SOP or strategy to test and pull in more people early on into the process. So it's not just about designing and having a good intake so you know what your stakeholder wants.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually designing scale in your own organization to be able to pull in people outside your organization. And that's
Mm-hmm.
a very interesting skill set that we don't meet as much. And I hopefully that will come out strong when people listen to this. So that brings me to my next area, and I think we've touched on it. The next kind of journey or exploration I want to do with you here is now on the practical, because we alluded to it. You know,
Mm-hmm.
when you are setting up your team members for success, when you are in those first steps of planning out the intake of a new project, hiring of a new vendor, that initial conversation with the stakeholder, what are some of the practical tools, tips, approaches you take that imagine somebody now writing all this down. So I'm going to put you on. No, don't imagine that. No.
No, I can't imagine that. But I mean, thinking about that, I love that you started with this like proactive, reactive, because that's a big way that I like to operate in general. And so I think about the questions that I think will trip us up, and I
Mm-hmm.
like to make sure that we've incorporated that into the process. When I think about starting a journey, I also really, really always start with what the goal and the end in mind is. I always joke, and I'm sure a lot of us in training know, everybody wants training for something, but is training the right solution? So I like to get really clear with whoever is asking for it. What are you trying to accomplish? How is training going to accomplish that? And what else are we doing around it? Right. So sometimes we say like the bricks and the mortar. It's like I can give you the bricks of like amazing training, but if we
Yeah.
don't have the mortar to continue to support the
Yeah.
behavior change, to support what we need to do, then it's going to fall into a drawer somewhere and no one's ever going to look at it again. And so for me, those are the things I want to know before I even get the team really going on it.
Yeah, I think something I do when I get to review our projects is I like the why question. I mean, the how is something I'm never going to be as good as the professionals that work with me. They're a lot better. Uh, and I have a whole story about my first reaction when I was told about the animal characters in one of the projects we did. I did not react well to that. Haha, it was very successful. That's the secret. So I've learned to be very accepting that I'm not as good as I was 20 years ago when it comes to design. But what I do still do, and I think that's important for any leader when encountering a request is to get out of that reactive mindset, is ask
Mm-hmm.
the why question. Understand that learning is at best 1/4 or even 1/8, you
Mm-hmm.
know, of the change that you or and the behavior impact you're trying to create. Almost have a checklist, right? Almost, for yourself, create some mnemonics or even a list that helps you be a contrarian sometimes. And through that distill some of the things that have to be done. What's the critical path? When you get into that first conversation with a stakeholder, that's, you've been asked to do something, something big,
Mm-hmm.
something small, it doesn't matter. What are some of the questions you ask them that help them inform you of what needs to be done?
I mean, some of them are those why questions.
Yeah.
Why is this now? Why now? I like to always ask, like, what does success look like in, 6 months, 9 months, a year from now? Again, really getting away from what they're often coming and asking for and more into what's important. The other piece is kind of a question around what's important to you. What do you think gets in the way or could get in the way?
Yeah,
Again, back to
like
my
that.
reactive, proactive kind of approach. So that we have that there. What data do you need to know? Those are kind of the high level ones. But I like to just have a conversation first before it is this like, go make this course that does this thing, because I need to know those things to make sure that I'm impacting and creating what they need.
Yeah, I've always felt that the best executives or managers let their team manage up to them. In other words, help them by asking the questions you ask, set the right parameters of how they will work together and make this successful. Let's switch a bit to technology.
Mm-hmm.
When you kind of look at what's available to you or to your employees as they experience learning, what are some of the lessons you've learned by how to use technology? What works, what doesn't work? What are some of the advantages or pitfalls in that area?
Yeah, we've been on a big technological journey. As we talked about in the beginning, healthcare can kind of be behind, and you have like an
Yeah.
LMS from the 1990s. So we have done a large scale and a commitment to our learning technology to create more equitable learning for all of our employees. So we did, in the last 2 years, roll out a new LMS, a new LXP, which is like the new piece, right? So now part of that is shifting our learners to go from, it isn't about me just pushing compliance training to you, which is what they're used to doing. It's about how you interact with and ask, the LXP for what you can find. So it becomes more of a pull thing. What I learned through one of our projects is that big course that we were launching happened to coincide with the launch of our LXP.
Yeah.
And we were able, and so I wasn't planning this from the beginning, but one of those like happenstance things that like now I think is amazing and would love to replicate somewhere else or thinks that it would, is that we launched that course, which was really one of the first learning experiences that was pushed out for a big initiative. So for
Everybody.
a lot of people, it was the first time they interacted with the platform.
Yeah.
What we saw though is because that experience went viral. That experience went viral. It had a gamified approach. People started sharing. The CEO was talking about like those, which encouraged people to go in the system and take it, right? Because you were going to be asked what your gamified thing was, right? We saw that like something like over 30% of those like new people who engaged in the platform went on to look at something else. But there's no promise that they would have gone in, like they probably would have gone in when they had a compliance training, which would have happened eventually in the year. But we got them in earlier because they were excited to learn something. And then they said, oh, wait, maybe I shouldn't look around here.
Yeah, and here I get to share one of my pet peeves because when we approach a project, we'll always ask what technology, what's your stack, we call it, your
Mm-hmm.
learning stack. And we try to encourage or fill in a gap. Do our customers who own these stacks, do they realize how powerful the tools they have are and how
Mm-hmm.
they can be meshed with the design? And I think that type of interaction is something we're trying to do more of because I can tell you 9 out of 10 times people that purchase these LXPs and LMSs are only using 10-20% of their capability. And that kind of a relationship with your vendors, but more important, with your own time you get to spend on these platforms is critical for success. Anyway, we're going to get to our last kind of segment, one of my favorite segments. But this has been great, and I hope viewers get a lot out of this, or listeners, depending how you see it. Um, so we're now 2025. You started a while back. If things you know today, what would you tell yourself like 15, 20 years ago when you started this journey that would have made it your journey faster, better, or more fun, or anything you would have told yourself then?
I mean, I think part of what I would have told myself is step into this space. I mean, I stepped into this space a little bit later. I danced around it, right? I did this nursing, and that's a huge, it's a huge part of what makes me today, and I love that. But I think had I known earlier, because I had the passion, right? I did all the stuff with learning, and like, what if I had kind of gotten and put myself out there earlier? I think I held myself back a little bit in like smaller companies and smaller things because I wasn't sure and was kind of so stuck. So it makes me think about like, what if I had made a jump earlier than I did? And I also feel like I'm in the right place at the right time, and I wouldn't be here without all of that stuff I learned. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag.
Well, I think I would say sometimes the journey is worth it. Maybe you don't want to tell too much to your former stuff. Let them experience it. But that is great. Well, I'm going to kind of wrap it up, guys. Again, thank you to those that listen or view our podcast. This is all about what you get from the peers we bring on or the professionals we bring on. So I really want to thank Gina for joining us and look forward to our next podcast. But with that, I wish everybody goodbye and thank you for this podcast. Thank you, Gina.
Thank you for joining the Learner Experience Evolution. All episodes will be posted on the Alencom website, or you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Please reach out to info@alencom.com with any requests or questions.